Hello, I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at the University of Manitoba and editor of the journal Mosaic. I want to welcome you to the lecture series, Relative Time, Little Time, that the journal developed in collaboration with the Dutch artist team Vic van der Poel, who are with us from Rotterdam today. Before I thank our sponsors, and introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba campuses are located, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you to our sponsors. The Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of Manitoba Conference Sponsorship Program, and lastly, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Art, and the Institute for the Humanities, all at the University of Manitoba. We'll have a question period at the end of the lectures and realize you will be recorded. Your consent is appreciated. My co-host, Carolyn DeCorno, Mosaic's managing editor, or Timothy Brown, Mosaic's conference assistant, can unmute you. Just raise your hand. It's always appreciated if you can ask your questions with cameras on, but this isn't necessary. Now to welcome our speakers, Anna Sophie Springer and Dr. Etienne Turpin. Springer will be known to some of you for her publishing atelier, Quai Verlag, and her ideas on the book as exhibition. Dr. Turpin will be known to others for his work in philosophy, design, environmental politics, and as a co-editor of a number of books on architecture, art, and the Anthropocene. Together, Springer and Turpin are principal co-investigators and co-curators of the exhibition-led Inquiry Resembling the Natural, the most recent iteration of which is Pawns Among Pawns, Threshold Behavior and Nested Life, that opened last March at Shanghai's Institute of Contemporary Arts. The two are also co-editors of the Intercalations paginated exhibition series and the book Fantasies of the Library. With the support of Germany's Stiftung Kunstfond, they are presently consolidating a decade of fieldwork and archival research on the cultural histories, or colonial histories, and possible futures of the natural history collections in the book as exhibition project, Productions of Nature. The title of their talk today is How Long Has This Been Going On? Natural History, Political Economy, and the Times of the Anthropocene. Please welcome Anna Sophie Springer and Etienne Turpin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining for our lecture today. Yes, I'm Anne-Sophie. Here's Etienne. We are talking to you from Berlin in Germany. And first of all, I really want to thank both Shep and you, Lisbeth and Jos, for this invitation. And it's so great to finally be doing this because it was postponed for a while. And it seems like we better not lose much more time to talk about time right now because the things change so rapidly at the moment. And back in November when we were scheduled to talk, I think we would have talked to you from a slightly different, somebody coming, from a slightly different collective mood. Huh? Yet, already back last year, we thought that we would respond to the prompt of the lecture series by entering it through this what we called crisis fatigue, through this experience of accumulative exhaustion and challenge and overwhelm of confronting and somehow dealing and finding a way both in the everyday, but also beyond the everyday of thinking through and finding a posture and a comportment to these exacerbated challenges. And we were at the time in the fourth wave of the pandemic. This is easing now. So the Omicron is easing now in Germany. But we haven't really exited the sort of social distancing so much yet, because it's still, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in Berlin, it's still been quite intense. And so, yes, we wanted to begin to talk via the idea of the crisis fatigue and offer in our lecture a kind of possibility of a response to think that through via our work as curators and exhibition makers, collaborators actually of Lisbeth and Jos in one project or two. And so just to start out, I just wanted to share on the notion of crisis. You can see my screen now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This definition from a simple dictionary on crisis, which I found was quite useful, namely the reminder that etymologically crisis, coming from Greek krisis, is in fact the turning point in a disease, namely that moment of change that indicates whether one is going to survive or get better or going to continue suffer. So the idea of the crisis is that there is a question of a fork, two directions, better or worse, yeah, but not as an open question, but in an existential manner. So the kind of decisive point of change that will inevitably happen. So as a turning point. And this is echoed in our research and reading by the writing of French philosopher, the late French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. What?
That's not the screen that you're sharing.
Yeah, you can see my slide, right? Did you see my?
The green outline is the screen that you're sharing.
You can see the slide with Bernard Stiegler right now?
No, we see your initial slide.
Okay. Just gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna share again the other. We had a glitch so that we lost our title slide and I had a second image open. So sorry. So here was actually for you to read along. You can see this now. Okay. Yes. So just for you, that was what you were supposed to see. So the crisis as the turning point in a disease. I said this, but just so you've seen it in case my accent prevented you from understanding or something. So then that thinking about the crisis as the turning point in this kind of pandemic, the collective disease of our society, we could say, in this anti-political collective context of a sick society that has a lot of problems to solve, whether these are ecological, now military, social, etc. And all of this, of course, is connected. And in that kind of thinking about these things being connected, interconnected, and interdependent, we've been reading Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, late French philosopher, as well as his translator, Daniel Ross, who in the Nag Anthropocene from 2018 makes this very graspable by saying that the expounded crises of our times are, of course, so connected that if we try to ameliorate one of the issues, we immediately automatically exacerbate all of the other issues. And therefore, there's hardly a way out in that kind of thinking. And he calls this a convergence of limits, which he then likens to a category 7 shitstorm, which is a very quotidian way, very jargony way of describing this. But it's been very useful for us to sort of think our way into and through, and getting stuck, of course, all the time, in this emotional and intellectual context of the last months, preparing for the lecture. And then there's another writer that has been incredibly productive for us in that conversation. And Etienne, you wanted to?
Go ahead.
So the other author, Ian Bauckham, Inspectors of the Atlantic, writing about transatlantic slavery and the legacies and the sort of toxic inheritances of that history, argues that, of course, time does not pass. It's not linear. It does not just go from point A to point B with no traction, but that in fact time accumulates, so that there's a layering happening where the past contextualizes and forms in the expression of the present, and that is what we are dealing with today. So that it puts into question a linearity of a straight progress, because we're actually tied to the specters of the past in the living. No? In Kindred, in Octavia Butler, we see this in a literary way, where the protagonist does a time travel between the 1970s as a Black woman in the States, returning in the same frame of time into the context of her ancestors, and therefore she actively lives the inherited past in her present. So these kind of questions are what inspired us to kind of frame our talk for you. So I'll then go on the next slide. I hope you can see it.
So what we wanted to do today or this evening here in Europe was to address this question of crisis fatigue that was already quite acute before last week, when the crisis accelerated, but I think also the ability of people to deal with it, also in terms of the affective and emotional and psychotraumatic experience of living in this particular period, has become quite acute. And so up until last week, when we would see images of nuclear war, they were typically related to an argument about the Anthropocene. And that argument was basically that the signature of the Anthropocene should be sought out so that we could mark the beginning of the period of this epoch using a geological signature. And that signature would be most consistent on Earth at any point if we were to take the radioactive fallout from our testing and deployment of nuclear weapons in the Second World War. Those same images are now being flashed in a consistent way through the news media after the Russian president put his nuclear arsenal on high alert, making, I think, the distance between Berlin and Winnipeg ultimately very small again. There's really no good place to be in a nuclear war. But the reason I bring up this example of the Anthropocene and the question that we're trying to address in this talk, how long has this particular crisis been going on? Which crisis do we want to identify? Is that there is a tendency within European thought, connecting Heidegger and Agamben, but also connecting to a long lineage of Christian thinkers, that we should be able to identify our contemporary moment of crisis by looking into the past, finding a moment of bifurcation or a diachronic cut, and saying that before that time, before that fork in the timeline, we were doing okay. And if we can identify that moment, in Heidegger, of course, this is a moment of the appearance of technology. In Agamben, there is a similar route, but nevertheless, there is some original sin in the history of the human species that once we can identify it, we can begin to shift the trajectory of our society, our community, our neighborhood, our species, our civilization, whatever the argument goes. And so that the how long has this been going on is not simply a fight over where the Anthropocene begins and ends, but is a framing narrative device that connects the Anthropocene discourse, European philosophy, Christianity, and the whole arc of how we consider whether or not we're going to survive a crisis if we identify its point of origin. Could you advance it? And so within the context of the international project of the Geological Union to recognize the Anthropocene, there is a search for the location of the golden spike. And the golden spike will be the site which is representative of the whole planet. So one point on Earth will be both the most typical, representative, and the most exceptional, and that it's the best place to identify this problem. And by selecting that site, the Anthropocene can be marked as a geological period there. And what we would like to suggest against the tendency of the spike or the original sin or the site of our bifurcation from being a good species that was doing okay to a species that is facing multiple crises unfolding at an unprecedented rate, is that we need to begin to think about the interaction of various temporalities, and we need to leave this question of a kind of Anthropocene spike behind. We include this image of Anthropocene merchandise simply as a way of reminding us that even in the merchandisocene, where we can buy a cool Anthropocene pencil for our mom in the gift shop after we see Edward Bertinsky's exhibition, that as a species who can merchandise our own extinction, we have excelled in a certain framing of crises. That is, the framing of them as consumable forms of entertainment. We may be the species most entertained by our own demise. However, if we were to move from the idea of a commodity, as well as from the idea of an original sin, an original site, or a golden spike, and start to take the clue of the Anthropocene as a scene, what is the scene that is producing this set of crises? And to be able to start to understand that scene, we would like to submit to you the thesis that has guided our collective project for the last 9 years, which is that the Natural History Museum is not a scene that collects examples of nature to be housed in a building so that we can all go and look at them later. It is a technology to produce a particular kind of human subject which views its relationship to nature under a very specific framework.
So between the last 8 years, we've then invested and engaged in this technology of the Natural History Museum as a scene in various contexts of exhibition. And I'm just going to briefly talk you through what those projects were, so that you get a sort of general introduction to our practice, from where then we'll focus in on certain moments of temporalities that we thought are worthwhile to share for relative time and little time. And so reassembling the natural, as Etienne said, is concerned with both the construction and the deconstruction and the kind of reassembling of images of nature through time. So we look at 19th century natural history legacies in the 21st century Anthropocene context through various lenses and frameworks in order to dissect the historical and traditional strategies, because we think it's important to understand them well first in order to develop suitable strategies to at least appropriately confront. Not sure if we can repair it, but that we can maybe talk about in the conversation. So the first project, bigger project in 2015, then brought us to Jakarta in Indonesia, because we were interested in a figure, 19th century figure of natural history, Alfred Russel Wallace, whom you see here, who as a collector actually spent 8 years in the Malay archipelago collecting specimens of natural history for museums in Europe. So he was instrumental in outfitting the museums that were kind of mushrooming up at the time, not only in European cities, but also in colonial centers. So for example, in Montreal or in Buenos Aires or in Sydney. And so he went to Indonesia, both to collect as a commercial collector, but he was also a very gifted amateur scientist. And so he's remembered as well as very, in the broad sense, very forgotten as a co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection that we normally associate with Darwin. So for our project, we we researched in the footsteps of Wallace's 8-year trip and journeys in the Malay archipelago. You see this smaller inlay image here from one of the islands we visited, where for ecotourism, one of the huts he was supposedly living in at the time of collecting is rebuilt, and you can visit it. So a very illustrative moment of this encounter and tracing. So here's the Darwin and Wallace paper from 1857. So Wallace is in the Indonesian archipelago traveling. He writes a letter to Wallace and Lyell, and then the theory of evolution is published for the first time in London. Wallace is away, does not know about it, but shortly afterwards, Darwin actually publishes On the Origin of Species. So Wallace is very important in that process, yet not the main figure on, as Etienne said, the scene. So for the exhibition, then we asked a set of decolonial questions, if you will, namely, what is the role of colonial collections in post-colonial contexts of collecting? We we instigated an open call and gathered a group of emerging and younger artists from Indonesia and did a series of workshops in the local collections of natural history in the context of the Indonesian Institute of Science, to develop an exhibition that would engage critically with the colonial legacy of the fact that the theory of evolution was on the one hand formulated and discovered in the Indonesian context, yet that's not a thing that is historically very well remembered. And then at the same time, there's of course a strong ecological crisis happening, biodiversity crisis happening in Indonesia in the current time. So our exhibition brought these questions together, and we created a quite multidisciplinary and also multi-generational exhibition scenario in Jakarta, where we were able to both present works that were made by the artists involved in our series of workshops, as well as specimens loaned from these Indonesian collections, and work by some international artists as well. Then this project led to a 2-year cycle that we realized in Germany in 3 university natural history institutions. So this project then was entitled Disappearing Legacies, the World as Forest. And we continued the research and the interlocution with Wallace. So here you can see that we used his documents from the 19th century as direct templates to confront contemporary ecological change and agro-industrial production in Indonesia at sites where Wallace had traveled and collected, but he had also been, in fact, in Brazil for 4 years before going to Indonesia. And so for us, doing this exhibition cycle in German institutions as an attempt to confront both the coloniality of natural history institutions and offer entry points and questions for how natural history museums could constructively do exhibition and cultural work on the Anthropocene challenge, on display strategies that adequately respond to the contemporary, rather than just using, as Etienne said, the Anthropocene as another moment of objectification and merchandization. So in the German context, we then opened this conversation up to looking at both the tropics in the Eastern and in the Western hemisphere on Earth. And we invited artists that were much more internationally active into an exhibition context that was a direct intervention into given display context of the Natural History Museum. You see this on the slide, so that we placed the artwork directly into an existing exhibition, and were quite interested in the sort of frictions and processes that emerged from here. We also then opened up the question of this traditional display strategies in the Natural History Museum context. So we developed a concept called the necroaesthetic, which we use to focus on certain ways of seeing nature as natural in the cultural and artificial context of a museum, by slightly changing and undermining the conventions of seeing, and slightly changing the objects that were shown from the museological context. We also, as curators, were guided by questions of how would we undermine a kind of taxonomical or linear way of showing things into a more diverse and multiplicatory, multi-stable way of being in a space that one could call an exhibition. And so this slide is a good moment to give a sensitivity, a sensibility for this, which we were thinking about it, like, how can we make an exhibition like a forest, more so than an exhibition that is a taxonomic table of species, right? And then on this slide is to remind that in the context of these 3 university institutions, we were working each time with specimens and scientists that were at home in these respective institutions. Lisbeth and Jules were part of the project, so they know this very well. We would bring artists into the collections, meet scientists, develop conversations around objects, and then from there unfold various ways of dealing with the questions that were developed in these processes. Etienne, I don't know if you want to continue.
Sure. So then after the German cycle, we really wanted to bring it to Canada. Shep, you were asking if we were going to keep going. I mean, we had a number of things that really had to then work around the pandemic, but I hope in the next few examples you'll see that the pandemic actually became also a really important phenomenon to think with. But so as we were preparing an exhibition as part of Reassembling the Natural called Nature Colony, which would address a very specific Canadian context, challenging the Donna Haraway concept of nature culture with a much more provocative question of how settler colonialism in the Canadian context produces also a nature colony context. And so we're actually going to be releasing a lot of that material in a forthcoming book called Productions of Nature, because it wasn't able to be realized except for a very small element out on the outdoor part of the campus by Martina Posan, an amazing Italian photographer who we've been working with. But nevertheless, I just give you two really kind of small but interesting examples from that research. The first is this little photo of clover that is being studied at the University of Toronto. And these are folks from the evolutionary ecology lab that we're working with. And what becomes really interesting is that clover is an amazing planetary study species now that allow scientists all over the world to study the particular genetic features of clover in their relative environment, whether it's an urban or rural environment. But the reason that it has become this planetary reference species for the study of climate change and pollution is because it's found everywhere in the world. How is it found everywhere in the world? One of the more interesting elements of that story is that it was known for hundreds of years that if one planted clover in between the rows of crops, the yield was much better. It was not fully understood until much more recently that this is because of a microbial activity on the roots of the clover, which makes it a natural fertilizer because of the fixation of nitrogen by way of the bacteria. However, because of various farmer almanacs and settler practices, the use of clover became a kind of planetary phenomena prior to the use of extensive petrochemical fertilizers. And in this way, this indicator species, which is now a global phenomena, both connects us back to the history of globalization as colonization, but then is also a contemporary index for understanding climate change. And so for us, this was this very small and interesting protagonist with a long history of human cultural relationships that we were hoping to explore in greater detail. But the greater and smaller protagonist of the virus arrived and cut off that collaboration. The other example, which is a non-Canadian one, but which really started to open up a number of other questions, is about the relationship of the concept of colonization at the scale of biological life. So we use that term not only to reference the political history of a power taking over the territory and administering the territory of another group of humans, we also use it biologically to refer to the ways in which different subspecies occupy an organism. And so the colonization of one's microbiome by a particularly nefarious parasite, for example, or by a particularly symbiotic one. And so as we were doing the research for the Nature Colony exhibition, we came across this story of the saga antelopes in Kazakhstan. And we were looking at mass mortality events, which are occurring with increasing frequency as a result of climate change, habitat loss, various pathogens that different species are exposed to. And in this particular mass mortality event, or MME, roughly 300,000 of these antelope died within one day of each other. And so this was a kind of massive scientific autopsy taking place in Kazakhstan over the course of several years to try to identify the cause of death. What could possibly cause this massive swath, these giant 100,000, 200, 300,000 individuals to die in exactly the same moment. And after a really complex process of research, to give this a really quick summary, it was identified that they could not have spread some kind of virus to one another because of the infection time and incubation time, which we've all learned about a lot in the last few years as a result of our own pandemic pedagogies, but that in fact, it was the condition that within the nostrils of these beautiful kind of alien creatures, there is an extremely important bacterial community that helps regulate a number of other processes within its own biological functioning. However, as a result of a temperature differential at the ground level, the heat coming off the ground produced such an extraordinary shift for the bacteria in the nostrils of these antelopes that these bacterial communities exploded into the bloodstream of the larger creature, which they inhabit as an ecology, causing all of these creatures to die from blood poisoning in a simultaneous mass mortality event. And so what became really important in the nature colony research was to address at the same time the political history and contemporary legacy of settler colonization as a political economic phenomenon, and to also begin to negotiate the question of the biological colonization of the body, and to address the fact that every body, each body, and each individual organism is itself an evolutionary ecology of other organisms.
So luckily, we got an opportunity in the pandemic to realize another show, which enabled us to continue that line of thinking that Etienne was just describing via the research that we found on the saga antelopes. And it led us to the exhibition Ponds Among Ponds, which Shep, you mentioned in the introduction. So we are now briefly going to speak about that. So Ponds Among Ponds was realized as an invitation and as a commission at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in Shanghai during the pandemic lockdown of the whole world. So I think we were invited in 2020 when we could already not travel to Shanghai anymore, and yet managed to have this wonderful project take shape in the spring of last year. We moved on to a different narrative protagonist in the history of evolutionary biology, Lynn Margulis, and her book Symbiotic Planet, in order to explore more the role of the microbiotic life in the context of ecological interaction. So Margulis, as you will know, was a scientist working in the earlier time of the 20th century, and then in the 60s, 70s began publishing on symbiotic life in the microbial context, bacteria, and became really interesting for us as a lens through which to explore these questions that Etienne was explaining in the saga context. But at the same time, we also came across an essay by environmental philosopher Tobias Rees, which he titled From the Anthropocene to the Microbiocene. And in this essay, which talks about the pandemic and coronavirus as such, he actually coined this phrase of the pond among pond, thinking about the role of the virus inside of the human body. And so he wrote, for a virus, the human gut is a pond among many ponds. Some of these ponds are located in the tropical rainforest or in the savanna or in the middle of some city, but the human pond is located in Homo sapiens. Viruses teach us that we humans are really little more than a multi-species ecosystem among multi-species ecosystems, ponds among ponds, all regulated by viruses. And so for us, already being aware of the mass mortality event of the sagas, we were then inspired by Rees's and Margulis's writing to think more about the nestedness, the nested ecology of life at scales, So you can have the tropical rainforest as the larger pond and the Saga nostril as the smaller pond, and all of those ponds are interlinked by climate. So the climate is not just a climate change, then you can argue, is not a backdrop scene in front of which Homo sapiens is struggling in the Anthropocene, but rather that our bodies are a fluid membrane in this whole motion and commotion and processes of exchange. So in the exhibition, then we try to negotiate in conversation and in collaboration with various artists. I think 6 works we were able to have produced or select in this array, but also again benefit strongly from conversations with scientific experts. You see them here on the bench of the installation by agency. So in this very strange context of making an exhibition, what happened was that the scientists were all local to the universities of Shanghai, but with the exception of the 2 Chinese participants on the artist side, nobody of us was able to actually go and do what we call site-sensitive, site-specific local research. It was all, of course, happening on Zoom, and so was the opening. You see us all speaking there together. And nonetheless, it was very beautiful. It was very, very sociable to enter in this space at this crazy time. So in what follows, we wanted to now narrow in for the remainder of the time that we have. We wanted to narrow in and dedicate the remaining time to some of the amazing artist works that have been produced over these 8 years of doing Reassembling the Natural projects. And we wanted to transition into that moment of the presentation via this image, which we have really, earlier, I thought it's a really belabored image by us at this point. We have used it so many times over the years, but it's just so good to use to identify this concern. So what we see here is 2 colonial scientists, probably economic botanists, working in Java in the it's dated early 20th century, and they are holding up a white sheet in order to photograph the coffee tree in front. So what's happening here is that the tree is being singled out visually for our photographic gaze from its environment, from its ecology. It's being turned into an object, into a viable object that for economic purposes can be planted in plantations, can be separated from its nested ecologies and turned into a temporality of capital, if you will. So there's a sort of acceleration to a use value of this tree versus its sort of cyclical temporality in the ecological environment where it would be from. Here we go.
Thank you. So this is a work from the Indonesian artist Tintin Vulia, and I'm really enthused to get to share it again. It's been a while since we were going through our archive in the last week as we were getting ready, and I said, oh, I would really love to address this because the question of evolution is so difficult to understand. It's something that in our work over the last 8 years, trying to make a public conversation about this without reducing it to a certain set of cliches is really challenging. And so in this work, the artist collected these very important tropical fish that are used to kind of give everyone else in the world the sense of a kind of little piece of the tropics in your fish tank. They have been selectively bred to be as kind of extravagant and colorful and to give this sensibility of a kind of wondrous tropical moment. And she feeds them these mosquito larvae inside this vessel. So her position is that the tropical fish is itself artificially selected. It is a human intervention into the breeding of this particular species to generate a commodity in the same way as the coffee tree is being selectively bred and isolated. But at the same time, if you can go to the next slide, that as the fish is eating the larva, we're actually seeing in real time a process of natural selection, which is those larvae which are uneaten and hatch into the gallery are releasing live adult mosquitoes who can then themselves bite human beings, use their blood to feed their own larvae. And therefore, this kind of repetition of a human, I mean, mosquitoes cannot reproduce without human blood. They are our kin. And so the artificial fish making the process of natural selection explicit, all done under the watchful eye of surveillance cameras, so that we can all kind of begin to understand the fixation that we have with these processes also comes to replicate a certain logic of a kind of surveillance culture. And so this is a kind of popular work. We did take some criticism from public health people over the fact that the larvae were not checked to see if they had malaria, so that we could have in fact been reproducing kind of malarial outbreak in the art gallery. And the artist assured us that that would have been in keeping with the spirit of the work. Could you just check that? And so another example, if the fish and the mosquito larvae are operating at a kind of organism scale, this question of evolution in real time, we think of also this amazing reference to the palm oil plantations of Indonesia. This is a kind of memorial in the botanical garden outside of Jakarta, formerly known as Butenzorg. And this is where the first palm oil from Africa arrived in Southeast Asia, 4 plants that were planted. And this memorial to them is shaped in this kind of DNA spiral to remind us that the palm oil has become literally the kind of DNA of the economy of Indonesia. And so working with the artists Armin Linke and Julia Bruno, seen here doing some really intense 40-degree fieldwork, we wanted to go out into the plantational scene in Borneo and Sumatra to begin to both try to understand and document the process by which palm oil was being produced at such a massive industrial scale that 40% of the island of Sumatra, one of the largest islands in the world, was converted from tropical forest to palm oil plantation in only a decade. Here you can see that the plantation has reached such an extraordinary scale that they're actually terraforming the earth in order to kind of create these terraced situation. In the foreground, you can see these newly planted palms. And so one of the key elements, and we can have more of a conversation about the palm oil economy if folks are into that in the Q&A, but one of the really critical parts to understand about this is that the ecology that this is being dumped into and replacing, namely a peat forest, is the largest carbon sink that exists on Earth. And so when the process of clearing that land involves burning the peat to convert the pH value of the soil to be able to host the organism of the palm oil tree, what you have are these massive releases of carbon. And so in documenting this with Armin, one of the most remarkable elements is that the government clears the way to do this. They channelize the land, they drain the peat, they allow the farmers to light it on fire. And then, as you see in this image, they send in the military to pump the water that they've removed from the peatland back onto the fires to try to slow them down. And so we achieve a kind of level of a kind of Sisyphus as a system, as a planetary system of pillaging the land, destroying the ecology, trying to produce ever more out of this cycle. And at the same time, the process of accumulation becomes both faster and faster, more and more global, but also runs out of time because the nutrients in the soil are depleted so quickly that these have really a 10-year span and then they're removed.
Yeah, I wanted to say one thing about the peat soil, actually, in terms of temporalities, why this is also such an interesting landscape when we think about times, is because, of course, this connects us directly back into deep time contexts. This very, very slow process of peat developing and the rapid destruction, as well as the very rapid life cycle of a palm oil tree, which is 28 years until it is being logged because it will no longer produce the kernels from which the oil is made. So what we have here is these different temporalities of or speed and slowness kind of being compounded, and they don't work together very well. So that's something that with an image like this comes to mind for me. There's a different kind of slowdown process, which then when the film that we made with Armin was finished, could happen in the exhibition context, namely by projecting the film directly onto a vitrine of the old, quote unquote, natural history scene. What the visitors told us was that they slowed down their way of seeing, and they started and began to recognize the conventions by which these stories and images of nature were being kind of offered to them before. So they began to see the culturality or the sort of artificiality of the nature image better by this kind of disruption that was offered through the interventions in the exhibition context. Whereas with Armin, we traveled to Indonesia and we were all foreigners. We were also working, of course, again, with local activists in the same context. And so we had several trips with the Academy Drone Indonesia, which is a collective of young people who train each other to use aerial photography drones to map illegal land grabs and sites of dispossession for the sake of palm oil plantations all across the archipelago. And then they produced these maps, which we were able to show here as artifacts, but at the same time, they are being used as evidence in court cases against dispossession and land grabbing. So that connects also to a whole discourse of the rights of nature and the question of the legal sphere in the context of ecological policy. And there's a different work that the exhibition was able to support by Brazilian architect and artist activist Paulo Tavares, whom you might be familiar with. So we invited him to be part of the exhibition because I said we open it up towards Brazilian rainforest ecologies as well. And Paulo has been working with local communities in Brazil for a long time in the context of what he calls the botanical footprint of dispossession. And so he made a work with a community of indigenous people, the Beo Chavante, who live in Mato Grosso and who were forced out of their ancestral land as early as the 1950s in the what was called in the Brazilian regime the pacification of the Indians. And so he worked with the Chavante on tracing the botanical footprint of their ancestral villages through fruit trees and other vegetation that indicates that these used to be domestic scenarios across this land, which the white and settler population argue is just either wilderness or insignificant land, and so used for ranches, etc. So he mobilized together with the Bureau Chavante a petition to the UN Cultural Heritage Association to classify this land of the Bureau Chavante not as cultural heritage, but not as natural heritage, sorry, but as cultural heritage. And so for us, in the context of our work, it's a great example where we can mobilize cultural funding for activist and political work on the ground in the locales of the people that we're working with.
Go to the,
we will accelerate to where?
Maybe just to Zanhe, I think.
To Zanhe, okay.
There's a few other examples we can talk about, like there are a number of really beautiful projects we're able to support, but maybe to just wrap up and open it up, to mention this one from Shanghai, because it was really beautiful for us. We did not get to do it or see it, but we were working with a group called the Zanhe Project, which is the Shanghainese way to say Shanghai. And what their research was is really trying to help people in this massive city understand their relationship to the geology and the watershed and the hydrology of Shanghai. And so we were really interested in how we could bring that question of resituating the human, that we all live in a watershed or multiple watersheds, we work in watersheds, and trying to resituate the art gallery itself within the broader regional ecology. And so working with Zanhe, we managed to kind of cut a portal into what the normal kind of closure of the art gallery as a sealed space for the apprehension of aesthetic forms. And we worked with Zanhe to develop a series of walking tours, which visitors to the exhibition could take out as a kind of postcard, and it would, exhibition continues outside. And would say, actually, you can't understand the argument of ponds among ponds. You can understand it in your guts. You can understand it in relation to you as an organism, but you as an organism are also in a larger nested ecology, namely the watershed that constitutes the surrounds of Shanghai. And so to really grasp the meaning of the show, we have to ask you to leave and go out and kind of follow these routes through the city that were essentially designed to accentuate geological and hydrological features that are normally kind of hidden or out of sight or off the beaten path. And so I think trying to imagine that as a kind of pedagogy reversing the question of how long has this been going on is to say that we can utilize the Natural History Museum and the art gallery and art museum as a way to begin reversing the trend of a kind of anthropocentric subjectivity, which imagines itself to be both the master of its internal and external ecologies, and instead use it as a kind of vehicle, as a staging ground for coming to terms with the nested vulnerabilities, but also the nested affordances of subjects who are all pawns among pawns. And in this sense, we could kind of disperse and do away with the question of how long has this been going on, and kind of give up on a search for the golden spike, and instead turn our attention to how could we make a scene that was one that we wanted to occupy, rather than a scene that we're constantly trying to escape from. So maybe we end it there.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna-Sophie and Etienne. Can you hear me? Okay. Really appreciate your completely pragmatic approach to thinking contemporary time through crisis. And in fact, that you were delayed so long, because we see so clearly how these crises are overlaid through in kind of like instance through different scales and within vastly different spheres, natural history, political economy. Really appreciate that, your efforts there. Why don't I open it up to some questions? And I have many. But I would prefer to offer it to the floor first. Any questions? Please raise your hand, and Carolyn DeCorno or Timothy Brown can unmute you.
Yeah, can I ask something?
Of course.
Yeah, okay. I have a few questions. Well, maybe somehow things that I was thinking about while you were talking. First, the image that you showed when they are holding up the white sheet in front or behind the coffee plant. I think it's a coffee plant. And as to single out that tree or that plant, which reminded me, of course, also so much of the white space in the museum context, how the objects in our Western museums and then all over the place, all over the globe, gradually during the past century, where the objects have been singled out in a so-called neutrality of environment, which I thought was really interesting. And I was thinking, okay, there's also knowing your issue of the exhibition as a book or a book as an exhibition, and then the image is still in time somehow, I thought was an interesting sort of connection. Then the other one that I found remarkable, I don't know if I completely got it, but you had these curtains in Shanghai. The curtains were also work, I assume. Yeah, also the drawings on the curtains. And this kind of singling out again of just a particle of a whole, instead of looking at the whole, or the whole with an H, or the whole with a double H, no, the whole world, or whole in the world, to sort of look at it. Also this issue of the lens, how to look at something when you single out. Do you see better or not? Do you see worse perhaps? And then the last thing that I wanted to ask is maybe to repeat or to elaborate a little bit more on how you ended this really great talk. Thank you so much. On what you say, the scene, I sort of freely wrote it down, the scene to occupy instead of to escape from. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that last, because for me, that's a cliffhanger.
So that's great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. And so on this white sheet image, what is really important. Actually, let's show it, because it's a really stunning thing. And so we were working with the Indonesian Institute of Science, and we had access to all of these glass plate negatives in their collection that are these historical photographs from the Buitenzorg Botanical Garden. But the photographs that were left in Indonesia are all of the photographs that weren't sent to Leiden. And so all of the photographs in Indonesia have people in them, because they're trying to get the shot correct, right? Yeah. But the ones that are sent to Leiden are the studies of the plants themselves. And so what we ended up having access to was this kind of B-roll of the production of nature as it's being staged, where you actually see the people in the photos, not the crop itself. And so what's so fascinating about this is that if you were to look through the same collection in Leiden, you would have all of these nice specimen photos. But in the Indonesian leftover collection, you get to see the production of nature as a thing. But I think that the white sheet and the isolated object becomes this question. You know, these are constant where they're also holding, these giant rulers, but then you see the person's hand, or you see the guy holding the ruler. And so this question of a kind of quantification of the natural world, the introduction of forms of measurement as a constant process of colonial evaluation and improvement, this kind of usufruct obsession with producing better plants and bigger plants and faster plants, elements of isolation, breeding, and measurement come to define the nature of the colonial world. I think, in a certain way, that this form of isolation and quantification, of course, it has parallels to the white cube, but it also is, in a certain way, connected to a much broader process of metricization of colonial production.
Just want to add one thing about this, because I just remembered that Lisbeth Jost and I went together to the Herbarium of Hamburg in 2017 or so, in preparation of the German exhibition cycle that we showed you. And this image here is so parallel to the technology of the herbarium sheet as well, where we have a piece of paper and a piece of a plant, a fragment of a plant attached on the piece of paper. So this, again, this isolating of a botanic organism. And why is that being done, yet not being talked about in the traditional natural history context, is, of course, as Etienne said, for understanding the economic value of plants in the colonial empire. And so that led in our process led to a whole installation of herbarium sheets that were usually not looked at in the Natural History Museum context, and we got those out of the collection and showed them, colonial useful plants as they are called. But so I just recall this because, of course, here we have the larger scene of it with the entire tree leading to the plantation scene, and then we have the smaller ones in the museum collections, in the botanical collections as well. The curtain, you're completely right. The curtain in this exhibition, we're standing right next to it here in the studio, because that's a work by us, sort of. It's our contribution to the exhibition design. These are all drawings from Lynn Margulis's books, which we had printed because in China, we wanted somehow to include in our Chinese exhibition the possibility of Chinese production capabilities. And so we were able to order this custom-made curtain for the show. But it was conceptually it became very important because it sort of embodies the exhibition space as a membrane, as Etienne explained, as a membrane between the body and the city, and a kind of focus space that is not to be seen as separate from the urban life just beyond that wall. And so for us, this microbial curtain really became the figure and the form of that idea, if you will. No?
But it's also, I think, just one thing we have to say is that the curtain itself is the point of origin of discovering microbial life. As this was in the late 17th century, the need to be able to keep good track of one's thread counts when running a textile factory led Leeuwenhoek to invent an apparatus which he could do faster thread counts as he was getting older and he had to work by candlelight. And when he started inspecting his curtain production, he found all these little creatures all over his curtains and was like, what is this stuff? And then he started using the same lens to look at everything, and apparently there was creatures all over everything. And so the curtain itself kind of replays this moment of discovery in the history of science, where at a kind of super graphic scale, we take the kind of advocate and ally of the microbial world, Lynn Margulis, and stage her drawings in the moment of discovery of the curtain, but then also open it up as a kind of porous interface to the ecology and what the theorist Abdulmalik Simone calls the surround of our urban life.
You didn't yet repeat your ending of the talk, but we have so many questions.
But just let me just say one thing on that thing, that the museum or the art gallery becomes what we could call a habitat interface.
Yeah.
And so learning to inhabit a particular region, a particular environment, a particular watershed, how can the Natural History Museum or the art gallery become a habitat interface that attunes the visitor to that broader nested ecology rather than helps them pretend that it doesn't exist?
Thank you. Yeah.
A couple of questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, we have a question from Oliver Botar. Oliver, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi. Fascinating project. I really enjoyed that presentation. So I was really struck by a statement that you made early in your talk, something about the Natural History Museum producing a certain kind of human subject. And I'm sure you've expanded on this greatly in your work so far, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that or explain a little bit more about that. I'm assuming that this is a colonial type of subject or an imperialist type of subject, but connected with that and beyond that, your paper, I mean, your project seems to be an intersection of at least two critical contrasts or processes. One is the tension between isolated specimens versus specimens within the context of their nested hierarchy of ecosystems. And on the other hand, the colonial nature of the Natural History Project in general. So just wondering if you could comment on the relationship between those two kind of streams of thought a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much.
Question.
It is a great question. It's an exciting question. So about the Natural History Museum and the subject, maybe quickly first. Yes, of course, indeed, that's a colonial subjectivity. It's a bourgeois, 19th century bourgeois subjectivity, but I think I said it very quickly in the context of Wallace. The publication of the theory of evolution also produces a certain human subjectivity, namely as the crown or the pinnacle of life on Earth. In a kind of secular framework, no, on the kind of at the top of the canopy, and then this was done historically in the process of separating and defining nature versus culture in a colonial and imperial context, where we very quickly get into very racist terrain about civilization and the savages, etc., etc. So that's one of the kind of subject contexts that we operate in. And then in a contemporary critique, that subject context, however, is in our research juxtaposed or expanding from, is probably better to say, from the discourses, critical post-colonial and decolonial discourses around anthropology museums and ethnographic museums, where it's very obvious the coloniality of these institutions and the coloniality and the racism of these historical discourses. But what we found in our work is that the Natural History Museum, even though we are in the Anthropocene, the Natural History Museum as an institutional context is not really unpacked in that way. And so we've taken a lot of reading about the other museum context and moved that over, which brings me to the second part of your question about the different scales and the kind of relationships that we move between. I would say that that's a acute analysis of our practice and of our method, probably, that it's productive for us to always bring in different scales from and disciplinary context and move them in together, and then see what happens in these contexts of friction and vicinity, if that makes sense. Yeah? Do you want to add anything to that?
No, there's lots of questions.
Okay.
But well, let me just add one little piece.
Yeah.
Is that when you go into a natural history museum and you're surrounded by dead animals that are made to look as if they're alive, I guess the kind of premise of the whole project is, why isn't that weird? Like, why isn't it like totally alienating and anxious to be in a space filled with dead things that are made to look as if they're alive? And why, like, kind of why taxidermy? What is it? What is its historical function? What subject does it produce? And in the what Freud calls the Darwinian trauma, the trauma that we as a species are not God-given the planet, but that we're in fact an outgrowth of evolution, we ask this question of how, against the backdrop of evolutionary theory, does the Natural History Museum offer a compensatory posture, which is, you can't have God-given rights to the entire world, but if you walk through this Natural History Museum, you will feel even though you are merely the outcome of evolution, you are the outcome of evolution that can fix all of the other outcomes of evolution to a presentation that satisfies your aesthetic apprehension. And so there is a kind of strange quality of trading the position of a God-given entitlement to plunder the world, and how the Natural History Museum can frame the possibility that even though this entitlement may not be God-given, our necroaesthetic practice reassures us that we can present nature better to ourselves than nature can present itself. And so the ability to create the artifice of nature through necroaesthetics for our own apprehension becomes a kind of mirror of our superiority. And I think that the role of the Natural History Museum in producing not anthropocentrism, but anthroposupremacy is one issue that we're really trying to address.
That's so interesting, and it reminds me that one of the thoughts that occurred to me while I was listening to you was about aesthetics, and it was about a kind of controversy, an aesthetic controversy with respect to biological representation, which has not been remarked upon very often, and that is Raoul Heinrich Francé's implicit criticism of Ernst Haeckel's Kunstformen der Natur, where Haeckel kind of isolated these undersea creatures and diatoms and made them absolutely beautiful, and in fact very influential on the development of Art Nouveau aesthetics. And then Francé in the early 20s or the teens actually rejecting photography and embracing art the way that Haeckel did, but in order to represent complex ecosystems at the microscopic level, mostly to do with soil ecology. So there's an inherent critique already going back to the early 20th century that highlights this kind of tension between those two means of looking at the world. And I really am interested in your I don't know if it's your neologism of necro aesthetics. It's quite wonderful. Anyway, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to kind of try and tease out some of these connections between colonialism and this tension between the isolated specimen and the specimen within its context.
I mean, I think in our kind of fantasy imaginary, if the Natural History Museum was to become a habitat interface that allowed us to engage with our nested ecologies more clearly, one day we would come to think about how we were obsessed with the speciated qualities of things rather than the process of speciation in the way that we today think about our obsession with racism as a species in the 19th century. That this idea that there was some fixed thing that we could grasp and isolate and maintain and hold is in fact a complete misunderstanding of this effervescent process of speciation that we are a part of, that we are hosting and participating in, and the display cultures, whether Haeckel's isolation of the diatom or the stuffed fox that we get to stand there and look at to see if it's returning our gaze. This is a form of pedagogical infantilization that has in no way advanced our relationship to the natural world.
In fact, quite the
In the
opposite.
same way that racism did in no way advance our relationship to the natural world or each other.
Thank you.
Sean Mathur, you have a question? Sean, did you want to go ahead?
Hey, Sean, can you hear us? We can see your emoji hand.
Maybe I'll ask a question until Sean comes back. Maybe he's run off for a second. Thanks again. I think it picks up again on what Oliver was mentioning, and also what Lisbeth was talking about. But I love this idea of each organism is a multi-species ecology, and yet, as you've been telling us, we're determined to build walls and against these kinds of things, immunological thresholds again and again, and like in such interesting ways that you work in these nested ways, as Oliver was pointing to. But I also note in that relationship, perhaps an analogy between the Natural History Museum and maybe post-Freudian psychoanalysis as well, with this kind of problems of after maybe 1930 that Deleuze and Guattari would pick up on. Can you talk about the relationship? You mentioned Freud. Can you talk about the relationship between seeing the Natural History Museum in these kind of terms, and also the analogy with psychoanalysis and the kind of immunological problem of the subject?
Ah, lovely. I mean, but let's just, maybe one thing to start with is this Freud remark about the great humiliations of man, right? And so some people have proposed that this idea of the Anthropocene is kind of the fourth humiliation. And so, but Freud is also amazing because he makes himself the third great humiliation of humankind. It's like to be like, there was Galileo, there was the end of a geocentric universe. There was Darwin with the fact that we were not given the planet by God, and we were just the kind of after effect of evolution. And then there's me, Freud, who had to come to humiliate you, to tell you that your consciousness is not even transparent to itself. You are not self-transparent. The idea that the fourth humiliation would be the Anthropocene is that, in fact, even understanding our own impacts, we're unable to do anything about them, but what we tried to ask, and I think becomes quite interesting, is for Freud, these are species traumas. These are what he calls the great humiliations. But when we think about, when you learn something about your place in the world or the universe or the cosmos, or with respect to yourself, that can give you a feeling of humiliation, but it can also give you a feeling of humility, that you didn't know some element about a relationship which is now revealed and makes you better capable in that relationship. And so there's a whole question that could be asked of, if we had better institutions, better visual culture, better modes of capturing how this process of learning was taking place, we could experience becoming more humble and having a humility with respect to the world and the cosmos, rather than feeling this kind of tyrannical humiliation, which we have to overcome with even greater force and greater aggression to the natural world, which in most of our discourse around climate change, it's, well, why don't we just build more walls and use more concrete and kind of militarize the environment? And so I think one question for us is, how could a renewed natural history museum or habitat interface enable a different kind of humility as a relationship of reparation and learning our place within a set of relationships, and not provoke the kind of toxic masculine fantasy, which is, I'm humiliated and now I must kind of strike back.
So sick, thank you. Thank you. Sean, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you all hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Okay, cool. My apologies. I was using my phone and for some reason I couldn't unmute. But first of all, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating discussion and presentation. I had a question about something you had mentioned earlier about original sin, and I was wondering if that paradigm of thinking, I think you had referred to Heidegger and Agamben, which, you know, I think you'd use the word like a Christian kind of paradigm. I'm kind of surfing around a few questions, but the first of which I guess would be, in your practice, do you ever find that paradigm kind of re-ups or returns in some way, that then you have to respond to it in your practice in order to kind of, I suppose, move away from it and also try to achieve, I guess, some kind of holistic paradigm that would be more attentive to interconnectivity and ecosystems. So yeah, I guess I was wondering if that happens, and if so, how do you manage that? And also, somehow does this relate to questions that you had brought up about anxiety and nature, and this kind of linking of anxiety with something like anthropocentric mastery over nature? So yeah, it's kind of an open-ended question, but I was really curious about that. If you ever find that it kind of re-ups or returns, and how do you kind of respond to that?
It's great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much. I think we get up with that all of the time, because we often quite immediately feel we trigger feelings of what we could call guilt, be that in certain professional relations with scientific curators that we meet in the institutions, where there's a kind of, perhaps not with everybody, of course, but a sort of defensive mode to respond, both towards the objects as such, but then also regarding the political questions that we bring into this space of science and natural history, which traditionally understands itself as a neutral or a non-political side, where for a very long time, politics were not the sort of the mode from where science was discussed. This has changed now, of course, right, with climate change increasing. But so the kind of triggering of guilty feelings we deal with a lot. Then in the colonial discourse, the question of complicity, which I think we also touched upon, of course, if we say the past isn't past but accumulates, it raises all of the questions of complicity or implicity. We've had moments where in exhibition walkthroughs with groups, people would ask us why we don't show more happy moments of biological cultivation, you know, like, why do we make this all seem so bad? What about biofuel, da, da, da? Why don't you give us a moment out? What Etienne called earlier, this sort of escape. Why do you make us accumulate here all of these difficult feelings? But that's exactly, I think, part of the work that we're trying to do, to be able to learn difficult feelings without immediately being triggered by the difficult feelings, so that you have more time to develop a response, an adequate response that isn't a reactionary response to this very difficult, what we call the convergence of limits and these accumulated crises. You want to talk about shame as well?
So one of the things, just coming back to this opening remark about Bernard Stiegler, I think that, say, the difference between the trajectory of Stiegler and Jean-Luc Nancy versus, say, Agamben and Heidegger, and this kind of Christian, whether it's an original sin or an original flaw or an original fork, we could refer to it as the if only moment. If only we hadn't done this, all of the rest of the problems were allowed to erase. And what we're interested in is there is no if only moment. There are a whole and also, and this, and then we made that, and then this came. And so this accumulatory process of time rejects an if only moment. And what I think is very important in Stiegler is that he says, we need to find ways to deal with the shame that we often feel of being human without letting that shame become guilt. And so shame as a affective, emotional feeling that I think we can all relate to, especially in the last week, looking at the way that our societies are organized and the terrible pain and suffering that they allow to be inflicted on innocent people, does often let us have a feeling of the shame of being human. What Stiegler worries about is that when that shame is converted into guilt, it becomes a way of limiting, isolating, and directing the creative energy of any subject or group of subjects towards a kind of subjugated position, and essentially as a form of manipulation. And so how can we agree, that there are some fairly shameful things? There are shameful things that Germans do. There are shameful things that Canadians do. There are shameful things that Europeans have done. And there are shameful feelings that extend across to all of humanity. But rather than entering a mode of a kind of guilt, if only we didn't do these things, everything would be okay. The question is, how could we develop practices and relationships that aren't based on if only problems, but the affordances of and also and other ways of connective relationships that include reparation, that include accommodation, and that include change as a fundamental aspect, that relationships are not fixed, that they will in fact go through different modalities and scales of change.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting. I've been, as a lit scholar primarily, I've been interested in horror and wonder recently, and been kind of questioning why I'm so drawn to things like horror as a genre, and I wonder if there's something similar happening there. But yeah, thank you. This was really, really interesting.
Super. Thanks so much.
Etienne and Sophie, I don't think there's any more questions, but we've kept you quite a long time, and we've had a fantastic back and forth with you already.
We just haven't seen people for so long. It's so nice to chat with you all. Thank you so much.
I was going to say, we kept you for so long.
So wonderful. So wonderful. Thank you so much for this. really mind expanding, and we wish you the best in Europe. Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone joining today. Great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great conversation. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Also, again, thank you for the invitation. Great.